Um, so my name's Elin Golden. I'm the Social Justice and Advocacy Consultant, if you didn't already know that. It's my pleasure to host this afternoon's session on living in encampment, mental health, stigma, and place. And we have some panelists here. We have Lowe Goldsmith and Andrew Nealins. And perhaps Lowe and Andrew would like to unmute themselves and just introduce themselves briefly.
Hello, hi everyone. I'm Lowe. Very happy to be here and grateful for the opportunity.
I'm Andrew. I'm also really excited. It's always great to talk to people who might have some good ideas and are aligned to help.
Lowe, you are at the Neighbourhood group. Is that great? Right?
Community services? So I'm a mental health case manager around the corner from
St. Stephen in the Fields.
Maggie and Andrew. So I've been fortunate enough to work with them together in supporting our community members outside.
As well as volunteering at the church, I work on part-time with TNG doing outreach in the wider area, and it's been amazing.
And John, maybe you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm John. I'm going to be presenting on options, hosting options for housing people who are currently homeless, including people with complex mental health needs. And I hope to do a good job. I hope to do a good job in a good way. Thank you. And
John is also a volunteer at St. Stephen's, but his home parish is, I believe, St. John's, West Toronto, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct?
It's true for now.
It's true for now. Okay. Thank you very much. Just before we get going, I'm going to go over something that I forgot to do in my earlier morning workshop, which is just a few group norms to make it to create a community where we can respect and honor each other and share our gifts and wisdom. So while you're not speaking, please keep your microphone muted. When you are speaking, take your time. Be as clear as possible to make it easier for others to hear you. Rather than responding to someone immediately, please share questions or comments in the chat, and you can certainly do so while our presenters are presenting rather than interrupting them, where everyone can read them and I can refer to them later. We do welcome people to participate at their level of comfort. The session is being recorded. The Q&A probably will not form part of the recording that is put up. Everyone is invited to share their video if they're willing, but if you prefer not to, you can always turn off your video and we will not see your camera. I do not know what is happening in my building that is making noise. And the final thing is we respect each other. Disagreement is natural, but disrespect is unwelcome. And as the moderator, I will step in if that needs to happen. Please be encouraged to send me a private message if necessary. And now I will turn it over to Lowe and Andrew.
Lowe and Andrew seem to be frozen.
I will go knock on their door and try to troubleshoot.
Sorry, folks.
They're
Technical
trying to fix the problem. If necessary, they will come and take over my laptop.
Okay. We can give them a minute or so. Feel free to introduce yourself and your home parish if you like in the chat. While we're waiting.
We're getting there.
We're getting there. Good.
Is that supposed to be a drawing of Maggie?
Yes, that is a drawing of me by a young, very young woman named Rose.
Wow. Well, I have met you. It doesn't look anything like you, but it's good.
Oh, I think it looks exactly like me. It's brilliant.
I don't think so.
Hello.
So there was a question about how we'll be able to access recordings, and we will be getting recordings together from all the sessions today. They are being collected and will be turned over to our digital communications coordinator, Martha Holman, early next week. Martha will do a little bit of editing to make sure that, the very beginning where everybody's like, is this bit on? And, this part where we're working out the tech issues, so that's not part of the recording. And so the recordings will be put up on our diocesan YouTube channel. And that'll probably take usually takes a week to two before everything's up and ready and ready to watch. But yes, you will be able to see other workshops that you weren't able to attend, or if you joined something late, or if you weren't able to attend the entire session, you can see those. So where are we at now? Andrew, I see you and Lowe there together, so I'm going to make you co-hosts again, so you can, and I'm going to spotlight you so you can take it away.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for bearing with us. We're obviously in the heart of the Operations Center now. And yeah, we're in the process of moving the slides into this computer, which seems to be able to connect much better. So please bear with us. We're going to change the order a little bit in our presentation. I'm going to go ahead of
the more structured stuff. So there may be a couple words that I use that we don't back up, but I hope that there'll be some patience and we can catch up with some definitions later. So first, I'd like to take the opportunity to really thank TNG for their steadfast support of our community and specifically of the encampment. They have been absolutely essential to helping us navigate some amazing challenges, and not least in helping me to find a way to work that is entirely consistent, though distinct from my faith, and that hasn't been easy to find. So I'm very grateful. Part of what I do for TNG from time to time is work in outreach and encampments in the area, and in other areas, working with people that are facing some severe challenges in their lives. And the mental health model that TNG relies on is what we'll discuss a little bit later. But it's allowed me to address two really big things that I had to figure out in order to do this kind of work. And the first was addressing a lot of fear. There was a huge amount of fear, both for safety in working with some people, but mostly a fear of inadequacy. There's a major difference, for me at least, in trying to help one person who happens to be right in front of me, and going out and finding people that need specific support and trying to get it to them. So I think what we'll hear in a little bit will relate to that pretty directly. There's also starts with an A, ambition. I think this isn't unique to me, but one of the things that I had to really address and figure out in doing this kind of outreach work is how to check my own ambition, how to focus on listening to the people that we were working with and asking what they actually wanted me to do, which very often is insignificant and will not address the thing that I see as the big problem I want to solve. But by listening really carefully, by thinking about things in a model that we'll discuss in a little bit, I've been able to identify ways to understand what people are actually asking for, to try and only suggest really practical things that will address things they've identified as problems. And by approaching things in that way, I've been able to maintain relationships over time that have allowed me to build up the kind of trust that erodes fear completely and makes things that were really undoable without that trust more accessible and allows us to be a lot more supportive and effective. And I think we have slides now, so
there we go. Okay.
Thank you so much for putting this together.
Yeah, I'm so happy to be here with you. Thank you everyone for bearing with us. Thank you to Maggie, who is now in my line of sight, for this opportunity, for inviting us to be here. It was a natural fit to have Andrew work with me on this project. And the three of us have met from, like I said, it's supporting our mutual community just outside of the church here, lovingly referred to as St. Stephen's in the Park. And I will begin. We've done introductions, and we're gonna talk about this framework that Andrew has been speaking about, and we'll actually come full circle and arrive back with you again soon. Okay. I'm gonna start with a land acknowledgement. I really need the grounding after all of this. So this land acknowledgement was given to the neighborhood group by Les Harper and Clayton Short, who are two brothers from Saddle Creek Treaty 6 Saddle Creek First Nation in Alberta. And it goes something along the lines of this. We acknowledge that we live and work on Treaty 13 territory, which is governed by the great law of peace and the dish with one spoon wampum. The law and the wampum state that we only take what we need, that we leave the lands and waters in good shape for future generations, and that we uphold the principles of non-interference in all that we do. This land is home to the Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Anishinaabe nations. These nations have taken care of the lands, waters, and honored creation since time immemorial. We take this time to give thanks to all of our ancestors and the work they have done to ensure we have a place to call home today. We give thanks to the Creator and all of creation for this chance to come together in a good way. And I do truly hope that this is a chance for us to come together in a good way. I really appreciate this land acknowledgement, specifically in the context of what we're going to speak about today. I want to draw our attention to this principle of non-interference. This is certainly relevant when we talk about working in community, when we talk about doing outreach, and when we talk about the history of how mental health has been taken up in Toronto, and how it's taken up in agencies and institutions across the city. I'm going to start today with a definition of a saneism. Part of an anti-oppression approach to mental health must acknowledge and understand this complex system, this very big word, and this, I would say, often forgotten about form of oppression, or misunderstood form. So saneism is a system of oppression which normalizes the conference of privilege to the sane and justifies violence towards the insane. Saneism is the operation of social, cultural, and political beliefs that categorizes people into insane and understands the insane to be lesser than or less deserving than people who are deemed mentally fit or sane. Saneism is the ideology behind discrimination, stigma, and fear when it comes to actions and policies and attitudes and beliefs towards folks that we've deemed insane or categorized as insane. Oh, I have to change. There we go. Okay. This training is developed from a training, or this workshop is developed from a training I do at St. Stephen's with all of our peer programs. In that training, I spend quite a bit of time unpacking the history of discrimination and stigma around mental health. I won't spend too much time on it today, given that we are moving forward in the best way we can. But I do want to have it up here for a moment to point to some of the specific markers of stigma, the specific brands of stigma that become attached or have become attached to folks experiencing mental health distress or varying mental health experiences. So in early days, we see the understanding that folks experiencing other or alternate emotions, realities are considered quite exceptional. And this is prior to colonization and industrialization, which really changes things, especially along the lines of productivity, functionality, and ability to contribute to society in a particular way. So during the time of the workhouse and the asylum, we see society take up the action of removing people from community who are outside of the norm. Around this time, we see the stigma of criminality and immorality being attached to folks who are exhibiting what we call today mental health problems. But this is particularly in relation to their inability to work at this time. I have a little bit of history here on the CAMH site, 999 Queen Street West, which of course began as an asylum with workhouse flavor, with patients laboring to build the wall to keep them in, and became over time in the 1900s a hospital for the insane, and then again renamed to a mental health hospital. Around this time, the dominance of the medical model of a biologically based approach to mental health or understanding of mental health comes into favor and remains dominant to this day. There's a particular stigma attached to notions of sickness, a particular idea around cure as redemption, again tying us to morality in relation to mental health, that really comes alive during this time period and attaches itself again to folks who are institutionalized. I won't speak on the Mental Health Act today, but I will move to the era of deinstitutionalization and highlight how in the 60s, 70s, human rights and civil rights ideologies were really reshaping the way we thought about our treatment and understanding of mental health, and the way we would take up inclusion or exclusion in society really changed thanks to the influence of those movements at large. The 70s and 80s were also the time when ex-patients, consumers, survivors of psychiatric incarcerations, of long-term psychiatric incarcerations, were coming together and resisting and advocating for better treatment, for more humane treatment, and for rights to be restored to folks who were previously stripped of those rights for the purposes of coercive treatment. Then the era of deinstitutionalization is really sort of an opening of the doors of large psychiatric institutions. In Toronto, we can think of CAMH, of course, and it's the Mimico Hospital, which is on the other side of Parkdale in the West End. As people were deinstitutionalized and returned to community, the promise of integrated community-based mental health services simply did not materialize. So while the philosophy and the integrity of the ideology of returning people to community is really important and valid, we know that funding, budgeting, political movement in the 80s and 90s didn't back up that move. So it didn't materialize. It's simply adequate housing didn't materialize, and community-based mental health services didn't materialize at the rate they needed to. And so we saw an increase in the association between homelessness and mental health problems. We saw a rapid closure of psychiatric hospitals also lead to increased use of general hospitals. So we have psychiatric wards in every hospital as opposed to a big institution. But I will say that markedly, like even today, of course, there's still a lack of community-based services and over-reliance on hospital services, which we'll talk about more as we move into today. So where we find ourselves today, the era of transient institutionalization. So in my approach to the work, I understand people experiencing what dominant language would call mental health problems as also being, as also something that I'm witnessing that is quite powerful and creative. So I bear witness to people coping with severe traumatization and witness people coping with ongoing oppression and violence. And in this case, if I bring it close to home to our work, it's the violence of poverty in Toronto. And really where we find ourselves once we've left the institution and we are trying to access services in community is that we find ourselves in between. So our community members that we support are really moving, bouncing, accessing, leaving, constantly you know, navigating access barriers around different institutions, and you know, nothing really lasts, right? Nothing that's very hard to stay in place for a long period of time. So this is why we say, why it makes sense for me to say that largely folks experiencing this kind of distress find themselves in between. So failure of political will to make real, consistent, radical change means that people's adaptive strategies, when extreme, keep them bouncing in between jails, prisons, city streets, in and out of short hospital admissions, alienated from consistent, meaningful long-term care, in and out of parents' homes, transitional housings, drop-ins, hotel programs, warming centers, and emergency shelters. Just continual change, and in effect, a continual state of displacement. The messaging, of course, being that there is no place where you can stay. So the social model of mental health is sort of the basis of how we can respond in a way that both acknowledges and acknowledges historical stigma and destigmatizes our community members who are experiencing immense distress. In this model, rather than diagnosing, rather than categorizing, we take up the position that we recognize differences in thoughts, feelings, perceptions, and ways of relating as adaptive strategies. And we recognize these strategies to actually be quite effective in coping with severe and traumatizing effects of systemic oppression and the violence that systemic oppression produces. So when we see folks experiencing trauma responses, fear, flight, freeze, fawn, these kinds of things are reasonable responses to incidences of violence. And we understand that on a personal level, like when we learn about trauma, when we learn about trauma's effects on people, we can understand the fear, flight, freeze, fawn responses that are often talked about. So if we can broaden that to understand it on a systemic level and see how the in proportion it sort of blows up with the proportion of the violence once it becomes systemic, it's easier to understand how a freeze response may look like severe depression, or how a flight response might look like hiding, running and hiding. We can certainly understand a fight response might look like physical fighting. And we can see that even in a bigger proportion, a fight or flight response might look like a new belief system that enables me to take flight from my current reality. I hope we'll be able to unpack more of that, but I want to keep moving. And when we come to question and answer time, I'd love to speak more about it. So we take a trauma-informed approach to mental health at TNG and in doing outreach, and certainly with all of our peers. This approach, rather than individualizing the mental health problem, sees it as a political and social problem. So we problematize poverty, racism, colonialism, environmental exploitation, gender-based violence. We problematize those things as opposed to problematizing the individual who is manifesting their distress, manifesting their ways of coping with those political problems. So at its heart, we are witnessing people surviving conditions by adapting their experiences and understandings and ways of relating to reality in a way that helps them to survive. I've put validation at the bottom of the screen because I want to return to it and I want to highlight it as I think one of the most underestimated and powerful tools that we have when working with people. And all I'll say for now is that there is a way to validate someone's emotional experience without necessarily agreeing with them on the reason or cause or effect. And I'll return to that later on. To bring us back to where we are today, it's important to talk about shelters. We don't have encampments without the shelter system that we have, quite frankly. Encampments are a result of, in part, like very, very challenged shelter systems. 3% of Ontario's mental health budget goes towards community-based services. Shelters are not in that budget, they're in a different budget, but it is important to recognize that that same number is true today as it was in 1990. So even when we have a growing shelter system, we don't have a growing shelter system and a growing economic economic distress, but we do not have growing budgets for community-based services to support people who are in distress. Shelters as institutions make unreasonable demands on people's attitudes and actions. What I've seen in my work, and I did work in an emergency shelter prior to the drop-in where I work now, was that people experiencing intense and distressful differences in perception, people who were particularly escalated in their distress were most likely to be unable to fit the norms and expectations of the shelters or of any emergency overnight kind of stay. Now, some of this is like completely understandable. If you're escalated in distress, you might keep people awake, but there is there's reasonable requests, and then there's unreasonable, in my mind, in many people's minds, unreasonable requests, like bed checks, violations of privacies, like attitudes, like decorum, things that go beyond reasonable. And of course, we know that if someone is experiencing an intensely distressful response to violence they've experienced in their life or to traumatizing situation, emergency shelters are far from crisis supports and are far from mental health supports. And those folks just frequently become the ones who are locked outside. So without meaningful and consistent support, people struggling with impulse control, substance misuse, complex physical health conditions, and those experiencing escalated distress are restricted from shelters and with alarming frequency and regularity. In effect, it becomes bouncing around in between. This slide I've borrowed from a 2022 CAMH study, so recent study, beginning to look at how service restrictions affect people, and also beginning to look at the likelihood, sort of trying to back up this sort of lived experiential knowledge that I bring, which suggests that people with mental health conditions are more likely to be restricted. This is trying to back it up, or will back it up. But what we see here that is the most important is all the places in between. So there is this sort of support for the idea of transient institutionalization when we look at the effects of service restrictions that make it more likely that people will continue on this institutional circuit, bouncing from access referral to hospital, prison discharges to hospital, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What we've been talking about recently is this, and how much simpler this is, and how different this possibility is, and how staying in place rather than moving in between is something that really makes sense to people. And I think really backs up the choices people make around staying in, you know, negative 10-degree weather, like you said the other day, right?
Mm.
Negative 10-degree weather with rats running around is favorable in a lot of people's minds to this sort of this bouncing around, this constant continual rejection, this constant messaging of there is no place for you. What we've seen in encampments is that people are finding place and creating place together. Andrew?
So I think now
I'm
that
very
we've
tired of hearing my own voice.
extremely briefly, now that we've covered some of the background and I think we can look back and I just want to, you know, recall that being able to understand somebody's completely reasonable reaction to a state of affairs they perceive as threatening and that is actually threatening their survival deserves some moments of thought and some trying to understand what could make somebody, as Lowe just said, choose to be risking frostbite and rat bites and constantly wet in a smelly environment as preferable to the insecurity, instability, and constant invalidation of our current shelter system. And that's not because it's an evil system or that it's intended to displace people. It simply is displacing people, and for whatever reason, community norms are not reflected in the policies and the activity within the shelter system, and they definitely, the norms that are most consistent with many of our clients are not compatible or supported there. And I think we've hit time. We should talk about John. Or
I'm so excited to hear from John.
I'm very excited as well.
This, where there is no frostbite and nothing biting at your toes.
Mm-hmm.
I think that will turn it over. Thank you all so much.
Okay, I'm
Go ahead. John, do you want to share your own screen?
Mhm.
Okay.
Okay. Are you seeing this?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to talk about the potential for housing as a form of mutual aid, and mutual aid is deeply political because it assumes a relationship of equals rather than a top-down system, and it comes from my experience, but I'm not going to use a storytelling format. That would probably make my presentation a lot more interesting. I did live the story behind this presentation, but it is not mine alone. And I'm keeping in mind that I have an obligation to respect other people's privacy. Okay, with that all said, okay. Hosting and sharing are an effective form of microhousing, the most immediately effective solution to the housing crisis. It's often said that the best time to build housing is 20 years ago, and people who are unhoused today and living in tents cannot wait 20 years. It is also a solution for persons with complex health needs to live outside the conventional mental health system. With people, it is almost certainly right now the most extensively used alternative to the shelter system. So for some reason, those who make our policies and those who report on our policies have decided to stigmatize this hosting, the host-guest relationship, as couch surfing. And this takes for granted the idea of living in having housing, of living in a host-guest relationship as uncomfortable, necessarily uncomfortable, unstable, and undesirable, and assumes that no remedies for the limits of the relationship can exist, ought to exist. And that's why we frequently classify also hosted persons as underhoused. I'm going to address these assumptions as statements of problems with potential solutions instead of statements of inescapable reality. And by doing so, I'm going to work towards figuring out ways that churches, civil society, and governments might work towards solving these problems, as opposed to speaking as though, well, they're just part of the way the universe is. Now, obviously, a big part of the problem is that right now, hosted persons have no standards, hosts and hosted persons have no standards and protections, and very little in the way of any kind of organized support from either civil society, which is the most important, from and where affinities and communities are part of fostering a host-guest relationship, that the information about how to do that is not being promulgated widely. It's not available to most people. I'm sure that this information exists embedded within particular communities, but it's not being shared. What this does is leave persons who are hosted or in need of hosting very vulnerable, and it discourages people who might be willing to host from doing so. And I will tell you that the discouragement is more than just a general kind of discouragement. I had people saying when I considered hosting, don't do it. So, and these were not people who were reactionary. I wasn't going to for advice to Toronto City Council. Okay, so what would formal and legal protections for persons in need of hosting look like? And the big part is increasing availability by removing barriers, and that's primarily eliminating bylaw restrictions. Also, strong statements against stigma from churches and civil society are very important. A big part of the reason that politicians promote single-family housing is a much broader sense that we don't have any responsibility towards the unhoused. We don't have individual responsibilities. We don't have community responsibilities. And really those who would host are being a little bit, well, actually, the idea of a host-guest relationship as a solution for individuals in need of housing is just not seriously considered in many cases. Preventing exploitation is very important. It's also very tricky. The ideal, obviously, would be standards expressed for shared housing in the way of privacy, of costs, of amenities offered. Unfortunately, those standards are necessarily biased towards privilege. Somebody with a large house is more able to provide things like privacy and amenities than somebody with an apartment. And it's important to provide supports to make sure that people who choose to host can do so, while at the same time providing a basic standard of amenity that is compatible with a dignified life. It isn't acceptable to have a situation where a host-guest relationship is essentially just the same as a congregate shelter. And again, I'm using very consciously, because it is very important, the concept of relationship, which is it's not bureaucratic. It is not superior to inferior. It is host to guest, and that really does. And in my experience, that makes more of a difference than a lot of other aspects of this process in this relationship. But another part of it, of course, is going to be a vetting process for hosts. And I'm going to go on to the next slide because that's where vetting is a very formal term and in many cases, in many respects, inappropriate. What we're talking about is a web of trust. The most important is informal networks. People who know people who know people who know people and can transform the outreach process potentially into a hosting process. It's based primarily on personal connections. Now, what I'm suggesting is that potentially this could be supplemented by introductions fostered and facilitated by community, religious, and affinity groups, and by mutual peer support networks. So churches that know somebody is in need of housing, and this is going on to a very significant degree today. We're just not talking about it enough. Providing introductions to people who are in need of housing, between people who are in need of housing and people who might potentially have it to offer. And that brings us to resources for hosts, which are primarily financial support. A lot of potential hosts are facing financial challenges, and even hosts that are not facing financial challenges, who are relatively stable, may find it difficult or impossible to take on the additional costs of hosting somebody, and those costs can exist. It's also important to do this, as I said before, to prevent a restriction of hosting to the privileged, because that then gets us into a situation where we are again talking about a top-down relationship with superior to inferior instead of host to guest. It's important that members of a guest's own affinity, own community, be, to the greatest extent possible, empowered to host them and to share housing. Also, supports for the mental and physical health of hosts include information, support groups, timely and convenient access to prescribed drugs. When hosting somebody with complex health needs, access to drugs prescribed by doctors can be an absolute nightmare. And it's important to cut through that difficulty. Doctors, right now, I don't know if you're familiar, the ODSP programs have lists of drugs that are incredibly specific, in the sense that particular dosages of a covered drug may not be covered. And that the difficulty of not knowing whether or not you're going to be able to get the drugs you're going to be able to fill a prescription without paying a substantial amount of money makes trips to the drugstore extremely stressful for those who are supporting somebody with complex health needs. Crisis support is important for a whole lot of reasons, but one of the reasons is that it's a safety net for what can be a daunting proposition. I liken it to bicycle lanes. It's possible to cycle without bike lanes. I've done it for many years, but in order to get people to ride and cut their emissions, it's very useful in many cases to have infrastructure that is going to support them. Crisis support is no different. If somebody's mental health takes a turn for the worse, there needs to be some compassionate care that's available very quickly and without the potential for violence that the police can bring with them. I'm going to finish with just a statement. Hosting, like all housing, no matter where you live, no matter what circumstance you live in, your housing is necessarily time-bound. There's a limit to it. No housing is truly stable in the sense that it is the nature of life in this world that we move on. A hosting relationship can provide time, and time, along with everything else, is sacred. It's a gift of God. If you can give somebody 4 good years, if you can give somebody caring and support and a place to live and a place to sleep and dignity for 4 years, or 5 years or 3 years. That's important. That matters. Whether or not it is something that can continue based on health issues, based on anything else, those 4 years matter. Those years matter. That time matters. The relationship matters. Jesus of Nazareth traveled and preached and was a guest of many for 3 or 4 years. The world has never been the same since. And that's pretty much all I've got to say right now.